We threw ourselves into the riddles of Daedric magic. We hungered for forbidden secrets. Knowledge and power were our gods. We got in over our heads. People died. My friends died.
The drunkard lay in a heap of sweat and charcoal. His fermented exhalations made the ashen rubble glow. The roof had caved in, exposing his shame to the sky above. Had he burned down the cabin in a bout of brandy-soaked madness? He couldn't recall. His memory was mist. The last the drunkard remembered, the place had been alive with revelry. Red drink had flowed like world rivers into 8 bejeweled chalices. The secret masters of demonic lore had danced around their staves and sang of Tamriel. But recollection made the man's concept organ pound against his skull like a doom drum. Flashes of veined light and resonations of pain formed a nauseating rhythm within him. Inebriated insomnia had blurred the divide between consciousness and dreaming. Did he sleep and dream of the wakeful horrors? Or was he actually lucid, morphing reality into fiction from his fatigue? The past night was tightly shrouded in fog. Time was smudged and vague. The young man opened his eyes, and his intoxicated blindness burned away. The Magnus Rift was at its zenith in the sky, and magicka saturated the drunkard's retinas. It was like staring into the gaping maw of a golden dragon, and its fire set his head aflame. He got to his knees, and like the dragon etched into his vision, he opened his maw and spewed bile and brandy like dragonfire across the rubble. In the corner of the ruined cabin, untouched by fire and vomit, rested the sanguine rose. Its petals were anemic. The hedonist's excesses had drained its vibrancy. The purposeless young man was at a crossroads. He could drink himself into oblivion, and not a soul would care. No one mourns for an orphan. His only loves lived in the depths of decanters and dusty tomes. Or he could seek meaning through piety and sobriety. The fire in his blood led him to the chapel of Akatosh, and so began the Draco Chrysalis of Tamriel's truest, purest dragonborn hero. And under the time of Gates, Tamriel would need a hero. The swollen, seditious sun was rising like a clenched red fist. The 65-year reign of Emperor Uriel Septim VII was brought to a violent end, and hell descended upon Tamriel. No sooner than Akatosh's sacred covenant was broken, did a wash of crimson seep into the overcast sky. The grey clouds turned bloody, like bandages over a festering wound, and from the earth, jagged arches of basalt emerged. Lava arteries like pulsing red rivulets marbled the stone, and inside those infernal arcs, films of incandescent chaos formed, creating blazing liminal breaches, spewing forth the hellspawn of the Deadlands. All across Tamriel, the Daedra hordes ran rampant, butchering the mortal populace. Dremora lords roared with mirth as their serrated blades cleaved the weak and defenceless inhabitants of Lorkhan's inferior plane. Every kill was to be savoured, for the Daedra knew that the lives they claimed were finite and precious. How could Dagon's armies lose the war when even death could not stop them? The demons were driven by a mangled form of hope, and served the motives of a cult of fanatics called the Mythic Dawn. Their leader was a gibbering fool, speaking of dethroning the octagonal usurpers. But they were effective. They assassinated the Emperor and cleared the path for the razor fists of revolution. Following the death of Uriel Septim VII and the sundering of the great Cyrodiilic Empire, the Oblivion Crisis began, and it seemed to all that the prolonged life of this mortal realm was finally at an end. For the world to endure, it would take the unyielding courage of the ultimate sacrifice of the unlikeliest hero, a lowly priest repenting for past weaknesses. A fatherless bastard with no surname. Surely the realm was doomed if survival rested upon this one man. Alas, sometimes the humblest mortals make the mightiest heroes. and there is no mortal more humble than this priest of Akatosh, seeking refuge within the chapel of Kvatch, while Dagon's minions make kindling of the gates and raze the city to the ground. Were it not for the champion of Cyrodiil, the Daedra would have butchered this unlikely hero, for he was not the most powerful, nor the most capable. What separated this priest from the rest was the willingness to give his meagre life for the preservation of a world that had never been kind to him. This is the story of Mehrunes Septim, who martyred himself for Tamriel, transforming into a brilliant golden dragon to thwart the god of destruction. The Septim dynasty spanned 478 years and 21 unique rulers. But it is the beginning and the end of the Third Empire I wish to discuss today. There is a stark contrast between Tiber and Mehrunes Septim that I've never heard spoken about. Where there is contrast, there is duality. Light and dark, black and white, yin and yang. Both are needed for balance. Like Anu Padamai, like Uriel Lorcan, we have Mehrunes Tiber. I've spoken in great detail about the man, the myth, the legend Tiber Septim. Regardless of his more questionable deeds, there is no denying the greatness of this man. And while the means by which he ascended may have been unconventional, sacrilegious, and triangular, not even the sharpest-eared elf can deny his apotheosis. However, while all of this is true, and I strongly support the claim that Talos is a god, I do not believe Talos is the ninth divine. I believe everything Talos stands for runs contrary to the eight. Some say Talos was a unique god. Some say he was but a Shezarene. Others say he mantled Lorcan entirely. Perhaps all of those possibilities possess a strand of truth, intertwined with a reasonable amount of selfishness. Whichever way you choose to perceive him, he will always appear the same, Padamaic. If the two-headed chief of the divines, Akatosh, encompasses the spheres of both Elven Uriel and Nordic Shore, then Talos was a divine fragment of the latter face. But what about the other face? Well, Tiber Septim found his Anuic mirror in his distant descendant, Mehrunes Septim. When we talk about dichotomies and trichotomies in the Orbis, we are talking about the Enantiomorph. This is one of the most enigmatic concepts in the Elder Scrolls, but don't worry, it'll all make sense later in the video. For more information on Talos, I'll leave a link to my Talos is a Fraud video in the description. As for Mehrunes, let's start at the beginning. Of the 21 Septim emperors, few were as well loved as Uriel VII. One historian asserts that Uriel had the diligence of his great-aunt Morihaus, the political skill of his great-uncle Uriel VI, and the military prowess of his great-granduncle Uriel V. With the exception of a brief usurpation at the hands of his elusive battle mage Jaeger Farn, and a subsequent 10-year imprisonment in Oblivion, Uriel's reign was a peaceful one. He brought order and justice to Tamriel. Another historian described him as having an agile mind, vaulting ambition, and an aptitude for threat and diplomacy. One of the only well-known failings of this emperor was in his personal life. Uriel had taken Kaula Voria, a princess of a minor fiefdom, to be his wife and empress. Uriel's biographer says this about Voria. Though she was a beautiful and charming woman, and greatly loved and admired by the people, the empress was a deeply unpleasant, arrogant, ambitious, grasping woman. She snared Uriel Septim with her feminine wiles, but Uriel Septim thereafter soon regretted his mistake, and was repelled by her. They heartily detested one another, and went out of their ways to hurt one another. Their children were the victims of this unhappy marriage. Perhaps this would explain why, despite having 3 legitimate sons to Voria, Uriel was tempted by the company of other women. One such affair resulted in the birth of the bastard named Mehrunes. It would have been uncouth for Uriel to raise this child, no matter the love he might have felt for the whelp. So he asked his trusted advisor and Grandmaster of the Blades, Joffrey, to ensure that Mehrunes was cared for, but also kept hidden. Joffrey says the following to the hero of Kvatch.
I am one of the few who know of his existence. Many years ago I served as captain of Uriel's bodyguards, the Blades. One night Uriel called me into his private chambers. A baby boy lay sleeping in a basket. Uriel told me to deliver him somewhere safe. He never told me anything else about the baby, but I knew it was his son. From time to time he would ask about the child's progress. Now it seems that this illegitimate son is the heir to the Septim throne, if he yet lives.
As far as young Martin knew, he was a farmer's son, and inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. In a way, this freed him from the tedium of imperial affairs, and he became an apprentice in the Mages Guild. But by the late Third Era, many aspiring young students were growing disillusioned by the organisation. In Martin's own words, he grew impatient with their restrictions. At this point in history, the Mages Guild had been embroiled in some controversies. Levitation magic was banned in Third Era 421, for example, and Hannibal Traven, who was narrowly elected as the new Archmage in Third Era 431, made numerous policy changes. Perhaps the most controversial of these changes was the banning of necromancy in all forms, even for the purpose of academic research. Necromancy is a nuanced topic that warrants future discussion, and it's easy to see why such a school of magic would be divisive. Mortals are very particular about burial rites, and some cultures, like that of the Dunmer, are intransigent when it comes to adhering to ancient ancestral customs. But what's the purpose of having formal institutions designed for the responsible study of the arcane arts, if you're just going to moralise over the more contentious ones? There is no better place for it. So you can see why young minds with a thirst for knowledge would be easily led astray into alternative forms of study. If there's one thing I personally know about this natural progression into darker arts, it's that there is a dangerously fine line between Daedrology and Daedra worship. Alas, it seems our friend Martin overstepped this line and found himself tangled in the riddles of Daedric magic.
As a young man, I grew impatient with Mages Guild restrictions, as did many of my fellow apprentices. We threw ourselves into the riddles of Daedric magic. We hungered for forbidden secrets. Knowledge and power were our gods. You can guess the rest. We got in over our heads. People died. My friends died. I've put those days behind me, but the bitter wisdom that one has been a fool is not without value.
It's hard to say just how far down the Daedric rabbit hole Martin went, and which princes he took interest in, but he proves himself to be knowledgeable on all things Daedric when attempting to decipher the ritual used to access Mankar Camoran's realm of Oblivion. He is aware of every Daedric artifact the Champion of Cyrodiil presents to him, though there is one in particular that he's intimately familiar with, and that is the Sanguine Rose.
I never thought to see this again. I once possessed it, briefly. A lifetime ago, it seems now. To obtain it and then give it up. I honour your dedication to our cause.
To be fair, there are worse princes to serve in the pursuit of knowledge. Sheogorath will claim your wits. Hermaeus Mora will drown you in ink and parchment and revelation. Molag Bal will punish your intrusions with an eternity of enslavement. And those are only a few of the prospective fates when consorting with the demon lords. But you should not take Sanguine Sphere for granted, because revelry and pleasure and visceral desires have the potential to ruin your life just as completely as madness and murder. The Sanguine Rose is an allegory for the experience most mortals have when dealing with the Prince of Perversity. Daggerfall's description of the Sanguine Rose says, "The Sanguine Rose is not an artifact most folk would care to have. The rose is like any other in that it will wilt. The more of its power that is used, the more wilted it becomes. Eventually, all its petals fall off and it loses its powers. Somewhere in Oblivion, a new rose blooms and is plucked by Sanguine herself, to be given to a new champion." Judging from his own comments on his foray into Daedra worship, Martin experienced temptation, but also regret in his dealings with the demon lords of misrule. The Sanguine Rose demonstrates that too much indulgence can quickly become destructive. The finest wine can turn sour in your stomach when consumed in excess. Unfortunately, Martin's blasphemies were punished with more than just a nasty hangover. Many of his friends tragically died, and it was at this point that Martin walked the path of penitence. This road took Martin to the chapel of Akatosh in Kvatch, where he served as a priest of the Chief Divine, and that's where he spent the rest of his days leading up to the time of Gates. Despite Martin's certainty that he was a lowly farmer's son, he was in grave danger at the advent of the Oblivion Crisis. The Mythic Dawn had been masterful in executing their grand scheme. It required a concerted effort. Invasions from beyond the confines of the Mundus had been stamped out by the covenant between Akatosh and Alessia, so long as an emperor possessing the dragon blood ruled, with the Kimel Adabal around their neck, and so long as the dragonfires remained lit, Tamriel would be safe from extraterrestrial aggression. But in the 433rd year of the Third Era, Mythic Dawn assassins fell upon the White Gold Tower, infiltrated the palace, and with bound daggers slew Uriel's heirs. The Emperor escaped to the Imperial sewers, but was cut down before he could escape. The one saving grace was that the Amulet of Kings was kept from the Mythic Dawn's clutches, and was taken to Joffrey for safekeeping. But the amulet needed an heir. At this point, Joffrey was the only living soul with knowledge of the secret Septim. However, I believe that Dagon may have had some sense of the power that dwelt within the chapel of Akatosh, as Kvatch was coincidentally the first major city to be besieged by the Deadland hordes. During the chaos, Waynham Priory was sacked, and the Amulet of Kings fell into the hands of Mankar Camoran. For more detail on Mankar's plans to utilise the amulet, I'll leave a link to my Mehrunes Dagon video in the description. But using Mehrunes' razor, Mankar remade himself in a shape capable of donning the Kimel Adabal. If the relic wasn't retrieved, even a Septim heir would be useless to thwart Dagon. Ultimately, with the aid of the hero of Kvatch, Martin deciphered the ritual needed to open a portal to Mankar's paradise. But there were more pressing matters at hand, as Dagon opened a great gaping Oblivion gate right outside of Bruma. This could not be ignored, as the horrors that would spill from this immense interplanar fissure threatened to overwhelm the Heartland, cutting Martin off from the Imperial city. Martin and the Champion rallied soldiers from every Cyrodiilic county, just over a dozen men in total. Though let's assume the hero of Kvatch was an unreliable narrator, and the true size of the army was much more substantial. Regardless of the number of soldiers, the odds were astronomically against the mortal men, who would face all the Deadlands had to offer, including a daunting Daedric construct called a Siege Walker, designed in hideous emulation of the fanged insectoid Infernium Daedra. The gathered men proved their valour on the merit of their participation alone, but surely the overwhelming force of Dagon's legions would have sent them fleeing, were it not for an inspired speech, delivered by a man who just a short time prior believed himself to be a meagre farmer's boy, living the modest life of a priest.
Soldiers of Cyrodiil, the Empire will stand or fall by what we do here today. Will we let the Daedra do to Bruma what they did to Kvatch? Will we let them burn our homes? Will we let them kill our families? No, we make our stand here today for the whole of Cyrodiil. We must hold fast until the hero of Kvatch can destroy their great gate. We must kill whatever comes out of that gate. Soldiers of Cyrodiil, do you stand with me?
Martin had stepped seamlessly into the role of Emperor. This speech would have made Alessia, Riemann, Tiber, and his father proud. The gates were closed, Bruma was saved, and the hero of Kvatch entered Gaia Alata. Mankar Camoran is one of the Elder Scrolls' most fascinating characters, and few mortals could have made it all the way to the doors of his Ayleid palace. But the Champion was an agent of fate, and even with Dagon's dagger, the leader of the Mythic Dawn could not cut the threads of destiny. With Mankar defeated, the lost Septim heir possessed the MacGuffin that could prevent the Prince of Revolution from razing the mortal realm to the ground. But Dagon was demolishing the Imperial city, unleashing fire and brimstone upon the seat of sundered kings. Martin and the Champion climbed through the rubble and ruin to the Temple of the One, hoping to relight the dragon fires. But the red fists had already gone up, and only a direct confrontation with the Prince of Hope would quell the bloody swells of insurrection. No dragon fire, nor any mortal weapon would banish the prince. The only hope was for Martin to use the Amulet of Kings, imbued with the blood of Akatosh. But Martin knew that unleashing this divine power could cost him his life. Nevertheless, Martin showed no hesitation.
I do what I must do. I cannot stay to rebuild Tamriel. That task falls to others. Farewell. You've been a good friend in the short time that I've known you. But now I must go. The dragon waits.
In one fateful moment, Martin leaves the mantle of mortal behind, and becomes a parallel of his ancestor Tiber. His blood, mingled with the blood of Lorkhan, creates a manifestation of the divine on Nirn. He doesn't die in any traditional sense. His body isn't left behind. He simply leaves this plane. The truth is, there has been next to no analysis of what truly happens to Martin during this deific transformation. His sacrifice is acknowledged, but Tamriel is too focused on rebuilding from the debris to actually provide any hypotheses. Everything from this point onward is our speculation, but I believe there's meaning to the avatar of the Golden Dragon beyond merely being a weapon to defeat Dagon. Martin's apotheosis is a response to Talos's, a balancing of the Time Dragon's scales. To understand the Golden Dragon, we need to consider a variety of factors. Who is Akatosh? What power is held within the Kim El Adabal? Who benefits from foiling Dagon's invasion? What virtues were at the core of the man who smashed the amulet? And how do all of these factors coalesce to create this divine avatar? These first two questions often come up in my theories, because they're arguably some of the most crucial yet overlooked aspects of the Mundus' lore. There tends to be an imperial bias blanketing all of Tamriel's history. This is partially because the Empire meticulously documents major events, and because the stories we experience through the eyes of the many prophesied heroes tend to exist in regions dominated by imperial culture and influence. So, understanding the nature of the chief god of the preeminent Tamrielic religion kinda matters a lot. But since I talk about it often, I'll paraphrase to the best of my ability, which admittedly is an ongoing struggle for me. When Alessia began the first Empire of Men, she was met with a dilemma. The Nords had helped her rebel against the Ayleid oppressors, securing her empire. And Shor, aka Lorkhan, was the chief of their totemic pantheon. The remaining Ayleid lords who bent the knee to Alessia, however, maintained their worship of the old Mary gods, led by Uriel. They were obviously outnumbered, but many of the liberated Nedic human slaves actually adhered to the same elven religion. Uriel, or Alduin, is considered an adversarial god among the Nords, for it is his purpose to eat the world. Shor, or Lorkhan, is considered an adversarial god among the elves, for he is the champion of men, and Uriel's eternal enemy. In order to appease both sides, Alessia created Akatosh, a two-headed god that would feature elements of both. Akatosh is a name we see all across the annals of history, and in part, this is because the Time Dragon is timeless, and all shards of him are eternal, regardless of when they're created. But prior to Alessia's religion of the Eight Divines, Akatosh was Uriel, or Alduin, an entirely different god with entirely different motivations. Without Shor's influence, the hidden head, there is no Akatosh. Shor needed to be the more subtle of the two spirits, for he was far more controversial, and likely to incite infighting among the elves and men in Alessia's new cosmopolitan empire. As stated in the text titled Shazar and the Divines. Shazar, as a result, had to change. He could no longer be the bloodthirsty anti-Aldemir warlord of old. He could not disappear altogether either, or the Nords would have withdrawn their support of her rule. In the end, he had become the spirit behind all human undertaking, even though this was merely a thinly disguised, watered-down version of Shor. It was good enough for the Nords. So, Shazar was created to resemble a declawed shore, but in truth, the burning passion of shore was buried in the heart of Akatosh. If we keep in mind that Uriel is an elven god, and Shore is the god of all human undertaking, who do you think would appear to Alessia in her prayers while she was an Ayleid slave? The Song of Pelinal all but confirms that the Akatosh Alessia spoke to was Shore and not Uriel. Here is an excerpt. "And then Perith spoke to the handmaiden again, eyes to the heaven, which had not known kindness since the beginning of elven rule. And she spoke as a mortal, whose kindle is beloved by the gods for its strength in weakness, a humility that can burn with metaphor, and yet break easily and always doomed to end in death. And this is why those who let their souls burn anyway are beloved of the dragon and his kin. And she said, and this thing I have thought of, I have named it, and I call it freedom," which I think is just another word for Shazar who goes missing. You made the first rain at his sundering, and that is what I ask now for our alien masters, that we might sunder them fully and repay their cruelty by dispersing them to drown in the Topal. Now, there are a few crucial details in this cryptic old fragmented text. Firstly, we learn that Alessia does not deal directly with Akatosh, but with the handmaiden. Varieties of Faith, the Nords, confirms that Mara was the handmaiden to Kain and concubine to Shore in the Nordic pantheon, so she would be relaying his wishes. Kain was the wife of Shore, so it makes sense that she would send the gifts of Morihaus and Pelinal. In the excerpt, Alessia speaks of freedom, which is another word for Shazar who goes missing. This rhetoric is remarkably similar to that of Mankar Camoran, the villain of today's story. In his commentaries, Mankar speaks of freedom, of liberty, of Numantia. Alessia wished to liberate men from the tyranny of the Ayleid elves, while Mankar wished to liberate the mortal realm from the tyranny of the divines, who usurped the Mundus from Shor Lorkhan. But we'll speak more on the significance of Mankar's vision soon, for it is crucial to understanding Martin's purpose when manifesting as the Golden Dragon. In response to Alessia's prayers, Kain sent her demigod son, the man-bull Morihaus, as well as a diamond soaked red with the blood of elves. This diamond was of course Pelinal, a Shezarene, powered not by any mortal heart, but by the Kim El Adabal, the Amulet of Kings. With the help of these divine beings, Alessia freed the humans from elven domination, and she entered a sacred covenant with the new lead god of her new pantheon, Akatosh. So long as the dragon fires remained lit, and the Amulet of Kings adorned the neck of a dragonblood emperor, resting over their heart, Akatosh would hold fast the gates of Oblivion. Once again I ask you, who would wish to safeguard the mortal realm from Daedric destroyers? Uriel, the king of the Oldmer, who desires nothing more than to escape Lorkhan's trap, or Shor, the true lord of this realm, whose heart is the very heart of the world. So, what power is held within this amulet? Shor's heart is the heart of the mortal realm, and in punishment atop the adamantine tower, Uriel and his champion Trinomac ripped this heart free and fired it across the continent. A ballad devoted to the Kim El Adabal states, "The laughing heart sprayed blood afar, a gout on Sirad fell, and like a dart shot to its mark, down in an Ayleid well. Magica fused the Lorkhan blood to crystal red and strong, then wild elves cut and polished it down to Kim El Adabal." Ayleid wells were used to collect magica in the form of starlight, and when infused with the blood of Lorkhan, an artifact of immense ethereal power was born. Kim El Adabal translates roughly to Spirit Stone of High Royalty. So, the power Martin Septim shattered between his fingers, mingling with his imperial dragon blood, was that of Lorkhan. We now know all the ingredients that went into forging this gilded dragon, but I believe this avatar was not simply a Shezarene, no more than it was merely an incarnation of Uriel. Like Akatosh, the answer is somewhere in the interplay. And now we are finally ready to return to that word I mentioned so long ago, the Enantiomorph. We've answered the questions, who is Akatosh, and what power is held within the Kimmel Adabal, but three still remain. Who benefits from foiling Dagon's invasion? What virtues were at the core of the man who smashed the amulet? And how do all of these factors coalesce to create this divine avatar? In order to answer these, we must first discuss this concept of the Enantiomorph. There are plenty of non-canon explanations, but I'll stick to what we know to be canon. The monomyth describes the concept in its most primordial form, stating, all Tamrielic religions begin the same. Man or Mer, things begin with the dualism of Anu and his other. These twin forces go by many names. Anu Padamai, Anwiel Sifis, Ak-El, Satak, Akel, is not. Anwiel is the everlasting, ineffable light. Sifis is the corrupting, inexpressible action. In the middle is the grey maybe, Nirn in the Elnefex. Duality is at the core of creation. The splendour of the mundus comes from the conflict of opposing forces, taking black and white to make grey. And to ground the concept of the Enantiomorph in reality, let's look at the real-world definition. This word comes from the Greek enantios, which means opposite, and morphe, which means form. Enantiomorph in simpler terms means a mirror image, an opposite form. It's most commonly used in chemistry to refer to crystalline, geometric, or molecular forms that mirror each other. So, these forms are equal, but also opposite. Uriel and Shaw combine to make Akatosh. Akatosh is therefore a perfect example of the Enantiomorph. I would take this a step further, and argue that Talos, aka Tiber Septim, and Martin Septim are also enantiomorphic. I alluded to it at the beginning of the video, but with all of this added context, I'll reiterate. Before his controversial ascension, Tiber Septim was a great man, but whether you support him or hate him, we all must agree that he was merciless in his pursuit of power, and was even willing to unleash a walking brass weapon of mass destruction against his foes. If you saw my video on Talos' use of the Numidium at the Siege of Alinor, you'll know that Tiber's greatest war crimes were carried out against the elven races. Martin, on the other hand, is as close to a perfect hero as you can possibly find. This mortal man was born without a father. He lived a humble life. He made mistakes that cost him his closest friends. And yet, he devoted himself to a pious cause, before stepping up to save a world that had never been kind to him. He was truly selfless, unimpeded by greed and ambition. Tiber might have been a great man, but Martin was a good man, and the difference between the two is profound. Some say Talos became his own unique god. Others say he mantled Lorkhan, or at least the Shazar part of him, taking over the god of human undertakings role in the cosmos. If Tiber mantled one half of Akatosh, then I say Martin mantled the other. Before I elaborate, let me just clarify. Mantling doesn't necessarily mean replacing a god. I've suggested before that when the champion of Cyrodiil mantled Sheogorath, he became a part of the nebulous Sheogorath consciousness. He became an active voice in the mad god's head. To mantle literally means to envelop something. It doesn't mean to outright become it. And the gods only know how difficult it is to define and categorize the gods. In some non-canon writings, Michael Kirkbride elaborates on this not so well-defined kind of mantling. Don't forget that gods can be shaped by the mythopaic forces of the mantlers. So, Toshraka can be an Akaviri avatar of Akatosh, with a grudge against his mirror brother in Cyrodiil. Just like Akatosh as we usually know him, could time scheme against his mirror brother of the Nords, Alduin, to keep the present Kalpa, perhaps his favourite, from being eaten. Notice all the coulds. The personality of the mantler can be important to the process. Ultimately, Talos worship eclipsed Shazar worship in the Empire, so while Shazar was not literally replaced, for all intents and purposes, his worship was replaced by Talos. I'd argue the same about Martin and the Golden Dragon. So, what was that damn Golden Dragon? Well, if Mankar is to be believed, the purpose of the Oblivion Crisis was to liberate Nirn from the 8 divine usurpers, including Uriel. The plan was to tear down Tamriel and restore it to its rightful ruler. Mehrunes Dagon doesn't care about domination. That's Molag Bal's sphere. He is a god of hope and revolution. He destroys so that the downtrodden can rule over what remains. He's not virtuous by any means, but he's no tyrant either. You could argue that, like in Lig, Dagon's liberation might have unmade the world altogether. But it seems as though Mankar did not want this, and rather wanted to restart the Kalpic cycle, returning to the Dawn, giving Lorkhan another chance to defeat the armies of Uriel and Trinomac. In his own words, Mankar says,
"And Dawn's beauty, the princedom of Lorkhan, misnamed Tamriel by deluded mortals. Yes, you understand now. Tamriel is just one more Daedric realm of Oblivion, long since lost to its prince when he was betrayed by those that served him. Lord Dagon cannot invade Tamriel, his birthright. He comes to liberate the occupied lands. Ask yourself, how is it that mighty gods die, yet the Daedra stand incorruptible? How is it that the Daedra forthrightly proclaim themselves to man, while the gods cower behind statues and the faithless words of traitor priests? It is simple. They are not gods at all. The truth has been in front of you since you first were born. The Daedra are the true gods of this universe. Julianos, Dibella, and Stondar are all Lorkhan's betrayers, posing as divinities in the principality that has lost its guiding light. What are scholarship, love, and mercy when compared to fate, night, and destruction? The gods you worship are trifling shadows of first causes. They have tricked you for ages. Why do you think your world has always been contested ground, the arena of powers and immortals? It is Tamriel, the realm of change, brother to madness, sister to deceit. Your false gods could not entirely rewrite history. Thus you remember tales of Lorkhan vilified, a dead trickster whose heart came to Tamriel. But if a god can die, how does his heart survive? He is Daedroth, Tamriel I Daedroth. This heart is the heart of the world, for one was made to satisfy the other. You all remember this. It is in every legend. Daedra cannot die, so your so-called gods cannot erase him from your minds completely. Tamriel and Oblivion rejoined, the mythic age reborn. Lord Dagon shall walk Tamriel again. The world shall be remade. The new age shall rise from the ashes of the old.
Mehrunes Dagon is the battering ram at the gates of the Mundus. He is the conflagration that annihilates what the Daedra stole from Lorkhan. Chamberlain Haskill despises Dagon for this very reason. He says, "Do not speak his name to me again, the master of scum, the pawn of every prince of true power, the dupe of every schemer in the 19 voids." Dagon is a tool, and Mankar Camoran wished to use this tool to free Lorkhan from his limbo, dead with the clutches of his realm barely in his ossified fists. So, who benefits from foiling Dagon's invasion? Usually, maintaining the mortal realm benefits Lorkhan, not Uriel, because Lorkhan loves his creation, whereas Uriel wishes to be free from it. But the Oblivion Crisis wasn't necessarily going to unmake the Mundus and allow the original spirits to return to Aetherius. It's more likely that the realm would have been torn down and rebuilt. This could just be physical, with the Mythic Dawn ushering in a new dogma of Lorkhan worship, abandoning Daedra worship. Or it could be metaphysical, taking the Mundus into a new Kalpic cycle, returning to the Dawn era. Uriel may hate Lorkhan's plane of limitation, but in its current iteration, he is the most beloved of all the gods. Could it be that the avatar of Akatosh was an avatar of Uriel's side of the god, not Shor's side? It may be Shor's blood inside the Amulet of Kings, but Akatosh is two gods. Tiber Septim, aka Talos, mantled Shazar, the quote, bloodthirsty anti-Aldmer warlord of old. This phrase perfectly describes both Shazar and Talos. Martin mantled what remained of Akatosh, the Aedric side, the chief of the Divines. If there's a ninth Divine, then it is not Talos. Talos is a Shezarene, and his interests are not aligned with the so-called usurpers who make up the Divines. Lorkhan would be furious at the assertion that one of his incarnations is associated with the spirits who betrayed him. Martin manifested as a golden dragon avatar of Akatosh's dragon head, the Uriel aspect of Akatosh. Martin was as pure and Anuic as a limitful mortal could possibly be, making him the opposite form of his ancestor Tiber. If Martin had been a Shezarene, he might have manifested like Pelinal. The Kimel Adabal might have merged with his heart, a diamond soaked red with the blood of elves. But Martin was not a Shezarene, and he became not a man, but a dragon. He saved Akatosh's Tamriel from a revolution that aimed to dethrone the Divines, and proclaim Lorkhan as the One. Thanks to Martin, the Kalpa did not end in Third Era 433. It instead entered its Fourth Era, and the largely elven gods remained supreme. Since the signing of the White Gold Concordat, Talos has been alienated from the ranks of mainstream divine worship. This much has been assured by the elven followers of Uriel. It's a terrible shame that Martin didn't live to rebuild Cyrodiil. In his hands, the Empire might have returned to its former glory, rather than entering an age of frailty under the Mede dynasty. Martin's old friend, the champion of Cyrodiil, through the lips of mantled Sheogorath, had nothing but warm words to say about him.
You are the best Septim that's ever ruled. Well, except for that Martin fella. But he turned into a dragon god, and that's hardly sporting.
Both of the heroes of the Oblivion Crisis left the world of the living behind. Perhaps in their new ascended state, they may influence the affairs of Tamriel. Perhaps not. But as the mortal realm endures longer and longer, disastrous events will inevitably be amplified. Satakal, the world serpent, is hungry, and tensions will continue to rise in the arena of Tamriel. Something's gotta give, and maybe it will, when we return to Dawn's beauty in the Elder Scrolls 6. Thank you so much for watching, and for joining me on this mind-bending journey. Much of today's topic entered highly speculative territory. The interplay of all these gods and heroes can be turbulent and confusing. Add to that a wealth of unreliable narrators and contradictory sources, and the final destination for us all will most likely be the labyrinths of Apocrypha, or the padded walls of the Shivering Isles. But I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any speculation of your own on the nature of the Golden Dragon, I'd love to read about it in the comments. As always, if you like the video, giving it a like makes such a difference. If you're new to my Pocket of Oblivion, subscribe for more. And if you wish to support this content, I'll leave a link to my Patreon in the description. But please, only pledge if you can comfortably afford to. Thanks again for being here. My name is Drew, you're watching Drumora, and I'll see you in the next one.
The amulet is shattered. Dagon is defeated. With the dragon's blood and the Amulet of Kings, we have sealed the gates of Oblivion forever. The last of the Septims passes now into history. I go gladly, for I know my sacrifice is not in vain. I take my place with my father and my father's fathers. The Third Age has ended, and a new age dawns. When the next Elder Scroll is written, you shall be its scribe. The shape of the future, the fate of the Empire. These things now belong to you.